3, 2, 1, burst.
It's Dave and Evelyn from the camera store.
And today we're taking a deep dive into the Sony A9 III.
The Sony A9 III is a camera that is perfectly designed for things like wildlife, sports, photojournalism. It is an action camera.
This camera is all about speed from its 120 frames per second, but the big headline feature is global shutter. This is brand new. It's the first full frame camera to feature global shutter in the camera world.
And this is exciting because it opens up the door for new possibilities for both photography and video. So Dave and I have had the opportunity to test one back home. We've been doing as many tests as we possibly could, a lot of really fun stuff, so we can give you our comprehensive review.
There's a lot to like about this camera, and when we first got our hands on it in New York, we noticed that it already feels a lot better than the previous Sony cameras do.
Yeah, they've made this camera a lot easier to use, and this is good news for the entire Sony lineup. They made a lot of refinements with the ergonomics, the shutter button, and just the experience of using this camera has come such a long way, especially with the A9 series.
This is a high-end offering from Sony, and they've packed this camera full of some really high-end features. And right off the bat, one thing you notice is that the viewfinder is gorgeous in this camera. It's 9.4 million dots with a resolution, it shoots at 120 hertz, and you can even go up to 240 hertz if you want an even smoother experience.
Yeah, speaking of the experience, I love that they added a C5 button on the front of the camera. All of the dials and everything feel really good. And we have the fully articulating hinge screen, which looks pretty good, nice and bright light conditions. We do have an optional grip. And as far as media goes for this camera, we have the CF Express Type A cards or SD cards. It's dual card slots, dual compatible. So I think, Dave, it checks that box for you.
I do like the fact that both card slots are dual compatibility, which is really nice. You can mix and match cards or use two of the same kind of cards. I do like that they've thought of that.
The size and handling of this camera is still very much on par with the A9 series, and it's weather sealed, so it's a very durable camera, and it has a lot of other professional ports. So we have the USB-C 3.2, so it's for fast charging and data transfer. You also have Ethernet, Wi-Fi,
and a
full-size HDMI. So it has all of the boxes that would be checked for professional use, and that's what we're going to get into, is the professional capability and performance of this camera.
So I was very excited to get my hands on this camera and put it through some torture tests against some other cameras because global shutter is a very big deal in the camera world. Traditionally, all these sensors have to do what's called scanning, and they'll scan from top to bottom of the sensor. And there's a phenomenon called rolling shutter, where the subject that you're shooting will move as the sensor is scanning, giving you some weird kind of effects, kind of a jello effect or what have you. So global shutter is going to remedy that. So we went out, put it through a torture test. We went out to a field outside of Calgary where you're allowed to shoot things, and we had a lot of fun blowing some stuff up, and we got some really cool shots like this. But what the most interesting shot for me was we brought out a compound bow. So somebody was shooting a bow and arrow. And what you can see when we shot against these other two cameras, we had the Canon R3 plus the Nikon Z9, both very fast scanning sensor cameras. One's a little bit higher resolution. And we're shooting at 1/16,000th of a second shutter speed. So plenty enough, fast enough shutter speed to freeze the action. So it's coming down to how fast the sensor can scan. If you take a look at the Canon R3 here, as the Archer releases the arrow, you can see the bow in the string. You can see it's not perfectly straight like it should be. And as the sensor is scanning, the string is moving, so it's giving us this kind of rolling shutter effect. Now when you take a look at the A9 III, you can see that the bow lines are perfectly straight. This is the advantage of global shutter, how it freezes the action. It captures everything all at once in a single shot without having to scan from top to bottom, negating any rolling shutter. This is very impressive to work with. The two other features I really enjoyed about shooting that day was the pre-capture mode. I mean, as you can imagine, trying to time somebody who's firing a gun and you want to capture that shot, it was so nice to be able to have them shoot the gun, and then I push the button and I can still go back a second and a half and play back. It's captured all of that. Now the other part we were having a lot of fun with was being able to shoot at 120 frames per second, but at the time of our launch, our camera is only able to do 16,000th of a second in continuous. And you can take a look at these series of events here, and it's a lot of fun shooting things and being able to play it back at 120 frames per second. Now, we can also go up to 1/80,000th of a second, but we had to time the shot quite effectively. And I was able to get a shot with Drew here. We were able to make it work, and you can see what 80,000th of a second will do. Now, future firmware is going to unlock it where you can do continuous at 80,000th of a second. That's going to open up a whole bunch of possibilities. One of the caveats when it comes to shooting 120 frames per second is the ability to autofocus while you're shooting 120 frames per second. Now, Sony has published a list of lenses that are compatible with it and can keep up.
This camera has a 24.6 megapixel sensor. It is stacked, and we don't have to say that it's fast scanning because of the global shutter. It's all being exposed at the same time, as Dave was mentioning. And it's interesting because this camera is definitely breaking barriers with this global shutter. And Sony mentioned that it was doing so without really impacting ISO or dynamic range. So this is one thing we were very curious about. It was really tough for us to test at the launch, but now that we've had more time with the camera, we've been able to look at raw files with Imaging Edge software, we have some answers. So one of the things that we noticed right away is that the base ISO for this camera is 250. What this means is that you can't give it as much light as its peers that have a base ISO of 100. So on a bright sunny day like today, where having a base ISO of 100 would be beneficial, you just can't go to that low level. Now, of course, for landscape photographers or people that are shooting other things, where having that base ISO of 100 is really important. For sports and action photographers, typically you're going to be increasing your ISO anyways, so that you can hit those really fast shutter speeds. So is this going to be an issue for you? You're just going to have to decide on how you're going to use this camera. But generally speaking, I don't see this as a huge problem. Now, when it comes to dynamic range, we are noticing that this has a little bit less dynamic range. But whatever Sony is doing in the file processing is making things look pretty good. I think there's a little bit of noise reduction happening in the files, but what we're seeing is that there definitely is a little bit of an impact compared to other cameras in a similar class of camera. One of the biggest advantages with the global shutter camera for sync speed and strobe photography is being able to shoot up to 1/80,000th of a second. Dave and I were very excited about this, and we wanted to be able to do it back home where we could take it into the studio and see what we can do. So we went over to Mass Studio, our good friends down the street from the camera store, and we were able to check out how this was going to work for strobe photography.
Somebody who's also very excited about this spec on this camera at 80,000th of a second sync speed is our tech guy and probably the biggest Sony nerd that I know, Gary, our tech guy from the store. First hands-on experience with this camera so far.
This is so nice.
Now you run a Sony A1 and you immediately notice a difference in the grip.
Yes, I really like it. It's really comfortable in the index finger compared to my Alpha one.
Interesting.
It's super, it's natural. It feels more natural in my hand.
That's good.
So.
That's good. Now you shoot a lot of cosplay, you shoot a lot of flash, indoors, outdoors. Does 80,000th of a second excite you when it comes to shooting flash?
Yes, it does. The biggest thing is after seeing everybody's reviews and all the stuff on YouTube regarding is how we don't have to use high-speed sync anymore. I can use full power at high duration. At bright light outside, and it wouldn't be a problem with this guy.
And that's going to be super cool because 80,000th of a second, we can crush any ambient light regardless of the sunny conditions, right? We can make day look like night and just use the strobe to fill in the flash.
Really interested to hear you say that like you have to fine tune sort of exactly where it is, where I'm not surprised because over the many years of you and I having discussions about flashes, we know your highest peak is your first, when you hear that first pop, and then it dips right off the bat. And it's interesting to see where you have to splice it to see exactly where it is.
So appreciate you coming out, Gary. We're going to carry on with our review here as well, but it's going to be an ongoing process to really fine-tune this camera.
Now, of course, one of the things that is really cool about shooting at 1/80,000th of a second is being able to shoot outdoors in conditions like today. Basically, if you're shooting, say, into the sun and you want to be able to control your ambient light as much as possible, having that flexibility up to a crazy fast shutter speed is very cool, very beneficial. Most cameras today, actually full frame mirrorless cameras, can shoot up to 1/250th of a second. There's some that can shoot up to 1/400th of a second, and even leaf shutter cameras like a Hasselblad can only shoot up to 1/4000th of a second. So we're getting a lot more flexibility with this global shutter camera.
So it does open up a lot of possibilities. I mean, shooting on a bright sunny day like today and being able to crush my ambient light with the shutter speed alone and still retain full flash power, not having to go into high-speed sync and reduce my flash power, certainly a really powerful tool. Now, what I found was there's a little bit of experimentation.
Oh yeah.
If you shoot at 500th of a second or below, no problem at all syncing it. But when you go up to 1/80,000th of a second, which is of course what I did first thing, grabbed an AD600 Pro and the transmitter and went to 80,000, and I was having trouble syncing it because you're actually faster than the flash duration a lot of times, and you have to time the flash sync, one thing, but also the cycle during the flash itself. So So what Sony has done is given you the ability to delay your flash by the millisecond, basically. You have a chance to go from 0 to 1,000 millisecond delay between when it actually fires and syncs your shutter speed. Now it's impressive because you really need to do that. And I found it was frustrating at first because at 1/80,000th of a second, you're actually taking a sliver of the flash cycle. So you might not get the most powerful section of that flash cycle, and you have to play around and experiment to get exactly the results you need. And it changes with your shutter speed, and it changes with the power of your flash. These parameters are all different. So you almost had to create a cheat sheet of what settings and what shutter speed to make it work consistently. And then once you got it dialed in, it was a lot of fun, and we were able to get some really cool results out of it. But it did take some experimentation to make it work.
Yeah, and really the bottom line here is that the flash technology is not as advanced as the camera. So the camera is outpacing the strobes that we have. I do think, Dave, that it's going to get easier. You might not need a super advanced cheat sheet at one point. And I think that now that we actually have a use case for having a short flash speed, it would actually give the manufacturers a challenge to be able to come out with some new technology on their side. So I'm excited to see how this evolves for sure. But I also have to mention that with Sony in particular, I mean, this is kind of pioneered technology for them as well. And any time that they've pioneered technology, they've improved on it fairly quickly. But we have some very cool technology to play with, definitely some new things to learn about. And this gives so much more creative freedom, and I think has a lot of potential for the future. And speaking of things in the future and technology getting better and better, we can't forget to talk about the autofocus with all the machine learning. I mean, this is Sony's best autofocus performance. And I feel like some of us even forget to talk about autofocus performance because it just works so well. It's great.
We've got, like, the real-time autofocus tracking on the previous models was very good, but this is their most recent one with their AI built into it as well. We forget how good it really is, and we don't really need to criticize it because it's hard to criticize it. It's so good.
Yeah,
it is tenacious when it finds something.
Situations, shooting hockey, shooting different sports, it does such a great job of holding on, being sticky on the subject, doing body recognition, face and eye detection. I mean, I've always been impressed with Sony real-time tracking autofocus, and I think that they're really hitting it out of the park here. The other thing we have to also mention for low light shooting and a variety of applications is that we have 8 stops of in-body image stabilization using their 5-axis system.
8 stops of stabilization is so impressive when it comes to photography, but even more impressive with videography. So we're going to bring Drew on the camera now and talk about his experience with video with the A9 III.
All right, Drew, we're excited for video because this is the first full frame camera with a viewfinder that has this global shutter sensor. Now, compared to other cameras, like you were comparing to the Z9 and the R3, what was the image quality like for video?
I mean, we talked a little bit, the dynamic range isn't quite as high, but I struggled to find a big difference. S-Log3, they definitely have touched the color up. It looked really good. It graded phenomenally well. We'll have a couple of test shots that you guys can see. And this is the first Sony camera that does no crop 4K 120. I honestly forget 4K 120 on even the FX3 has a crop. 4K 60 is downsampled from the full sensor readout. 4K 120 isn't, but you gotta have some compromises somewhere. And then the 1080p at 240, all of it looked good, all of it looked clean. Colors were coming across pretty well, and yeah, for all of the talk of lower dynamic range, I wasn't really having any issues with it.
Yeah, and then from a functionality standpoint, of course, you can take advantage of that 8 stops of in-body image stabilization for video.
Yes. And it's 8 stops of in-body image stabilization. Like when people talk about, 7-8 stops, I'm so used to them being dual stabilization or, oh, you need the electronic stabilization boosted or something. No, it's just 8 stops, EV, direct in-body. You don't even need to use the new catalyst. So like, it's gonna be insane to see with all the extra boosts and stuff apply. They're starting to say gimbal-style stabilization, and I'm starting to believe them, honestly, at this point.
Now, from a functionality standpoint, ergonomics is, again, very nice. You got that EVF, full-size HDMI port, gives you some benefits there.
We keep ragging on like full-size HDMI ports. They're just so
nice.
much better. They're so much more usable. You don't torque on them quite as hard. The data it's 16-bit RAW coming out of the HDMI. Like, they really did not skimp on the video, which is something I love to see, because so often we see these action sports cameras where they're like, oh, hyper-focused on action sports photography. And then they have another camera where it's action sports video. But it really does feel like they took a good look at this and went, this is what videographers and photographers both need. And they smashed the two of them together.
So did you find that there was any disadvantages and like some maybe use cases where you wouldn't choose this as a video tool?
Yeah, a couple of small ones. So the in-body stabilization, excellent, but when we turned it on, I was noticing it was starting to soften a little bit. And additionally, it does feel like there's a more aggressive noise reduction just directly into the footage. I know you were mentioning that as well. And it does have worse contrast in lower light situations. So really nothing that we weren't expecting, honestly, with everything that's going on. But with the lack of rolling shutter, artifacting being non-issue.
Yeah, it's funny how when you're watching video and your mind kind of gets used to seeing like the jello effect, the rolling shutter,
Exactly,
but
yeah.
then when you don't see it, there's just something in your brain that clicks that this is like higher production quality, that it just looks really good. Almost not hyper real, but it just gives you that more clear, precise look.
And the fact that this is, again, the first global shutter full frame system.
Yeah, global shutters have been used a lot in video and cinema cameras, but you don't have things like IBIS, good autofocus, no EVF. And so this is exciting for the world of video. So
And there's literally nothing else on the market like that. It makes it a really compelling option, and honestly something that I would struggle to not pick in most cases.
well, Dave, after a lot of testing with this camera, trying to figure out all the puzzle pieces of things that we didn't have the answers to in our launch, I think our sentiments about this camera are still true.
I 100% agree. I mean, we put it through in the studio and playing around with the flashes, which was honestly quite frustrating at first for me because I had really had to figure out how to get into the brain of this camera and get my sync speeds happening with the different flash powers and make it work that way. It was very impressive to see what this camera is capable of, and you can totally see how this camera is purpose built for high-end sports and action photographers.
Yeah, and video as well. I mean, again, this is a very compelling video tool. This global shutter does provide some new opportunities, some new technology that we haven't seen before from Sony or other full-frame mirrorless camera manufacturers. Now, is this camera niche? I would still say, yeah, it is. It doesn't check all the boxes of being kind of like the ultimate flagship camera. You know, the resolution is kind of low for that. It doesn't necessarily have as much dynamic range.
I mean, if this is a niche camera, yeah, it's certainly a niche camera for high-end sports and action photographers. And it's the high-speed sync is certainly going to help out people, but the 120 frames per second at the push of a button, but also the global shutter, how it helps you capture those very fleeting moments with no rolling shutter whatsoever. And things like really tricky lighting situations. Often sports photographers are in poor arenas with bad lighting, or rock star photographers who are shooting concerts. We need to be able to control the flickering of lights. And if we have multiple light sources, we can't just dial in the flicker for that, right?
Yeah.
So global shutter is really going to help out.
Definitely. Now, the experience of using this camera is fantastic. I think this is Sony's best camera in terms of ergonomics,
100%.
feel, control. They've really talked to pros and have put a lot of that thought into the camera, and I think it's their best iteration yet in that regard. Now, is this a great camera when it comes to image quality? I do agree with them that it is kind of the sweet spot for photojournalists and sports photographers, people that are delivering files very quickly. And what we found is that the images that are coming out of the camera do look great. The way that Sony is processing the images, I think, has done a good job, despite not having as much dynamic range to some comparable modern models.
I mean, I think we've been spoiled with dynamic range over the last few years anyways.
True, yeah.
I'm okay losing a little bit of dynamic range for the advantages that global shutter gives me.
Absolutely. And again, I think that this does kind of seal the deal as being like the ultimate sports and action photographer camera. Is it for everyone? Is it kind of like an all-purpose jack of all trades camera? Maybe not, but if you're someone that does have the use cases where you want to be able to hit that action, have the pre-burst, some excellent video capabilities, then I think it does check a lot of those boxes. But of course, we want to know, what do you think of this new camera and the new technology from Sony? Did we answer all of your questions? Do you still have more? Let us know in the comments below.
And make sure you like and subscribe.
This has been Dave and Evelyn from the Camera Store, and we'll catch you again very soon.
Hey, thanks for sticking around and watching this very exciting episode on the Sony A9 III. If you want to check out more of our recent content, click up here. And if you are Canadian and want to shop local, check out thecamerastore.com down here.